Okay, that's great. Now that we've sorted the E problem, we will have our PowerPoint because it's necessary for this lecture, this seminar that we're having today, for which we're delighted, Stathis, to have you with us and to present your latest book. You all know Stathis as a Glasgow Professor of Government from the DPIR. But also All Souls College, fellow there. Stathis has been dealing with a number of things in his academic career. He's very well known for his work on conflict, civil war, violence. Indeed, he's a point of reference in those kind of concepts. We always like to invite Stathis when we have conflict-related issues. But he's done a lot of work on Greece as well, and this is part of Greece. May I also say that Stathis is very well known public intellectual in Greece, and he is also, when he did his book on tragedies and triumphs of the Greek story, modern story, he also did a series of programs on television. So we also had an event on that Stathis, which was great, and I've seen the series, and it was absolutely magnificent. So today we are talking about his book, Big Bang. 1970, 1973. It is in Greek.
And I'll explain why.
I've read most of it because it's a very big book. I mean, I don't know how he did it, honestly. That's what I was asking him to explain. But that's also a topic which is very close to my heart as well, because I've done my PhD work on the Greek dictatorship. So I'm looking at
reference list.
Thank you. Yeah, so over to you, Stathis. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to give you, I've done a couple of presentations, but just to present the book today, I'm going to try to also depart from it, but at the same time, I want to explain what this book is all about, and I'm also giving it a sort of broader perspective. So the questions that I want to address is whether the absence of freedom, the absence of democracy, is suppressive of culture, of cultural life. There are two sort of immediate responses that come to mind. The most immediate and obvious is to say that repression is inimical to cultural life for obvious reasons, but there is also the opposite. You can find the argument that sometimes difficult times find people to find some sort of refuge in culture as well. And the reality, of course, is that there is considerable variation. If you look at various cases, if you compare, for example, Chile versus Brazil in the 1970s, you find that there is much less cultural life in Chile, there is much more in Brazil. East Germany and Czechoslovakia, we have some interesting comparisons, much more cultural life in Czechoslovakia. Václav Havel, who becomes the leader of the opposition, comes from the world of theater, for example. And also Iran versus North Korea. There doesn't seem to be a lot of cultural life in North Korea, even though I'm not sure, I haven't done the research, but there is a tremendous amount of high quality cultural life in Iran, especially cinema and fiction, among other areas, which is surprising given the nature of the regime. So the question is, how exactly is authoritarianism associated to cultural life? And what can we learn from asking that question? So I'm not going to say much about the Greek dictatorship, besides the obvious things. There was a military coup in 1967 that interrupted democratic life, which was moving towards more and more liberalization, but at the same time, through a variety of political crises at the same time. It is a military coup that has a number of characteristics. It's the last successful military coup in Europe. It's also a military coup that was not only oriented against politicians and the political system, but also against the hierarchy of the military. So it was the colonels organizing a coup against the generals. So there are a number of characteristics that accompany that. And it's a regime that lasted for 7 years until 1974. And it collapsed as a result of its attempt to export the military dictatorship to Cyprus, which caused an invasion from Turkey in 1974, in the summer of 1974, which the regime had not anticipated, was not prepared for, and could not face. And it collapsed as a result of military defeat, very much like the Argentinian dictatorship collapsed after military defeat in the Falklands War. So it lasted for 7 years, and the standard account is that during those 7 years, there was so much repression in Greece and so much control of intellectual and cultural life that the situation was very bleak. So that's the standard account. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the perception in general. And in fact, if you look at accounts of cultural life, the standard narrative is, and indeed there was a flourishing of cultural life in the early 60s. Remember, you have to keep in mind that Greece experienced a very traumatic period of occupation during the Second World War and subsequent civil war, almost up to 1950. So from 1950 to 1960, things are difficult. And in the beginning of the 60s, there is a lot of interesting developments in culture, in music, in theater, in literature. And people describe that period as a period of Renaissance. And that was interrupted by the dictatorship, which then leads to a period, the narrative goes, of cultural desert, and things return to normal in 1974. So if you look at books of literary criticism, for example, they usually cover the period up to the early 1960s, and then they cover the period after 1974. There's a sort of gap that nobody really addresses because the perception is there wasn't anything worth covering. So this is described as a dark period in which Greek society was stunted, couldn't really develop politically, but also culturally and spiritually. And insofar as there was cultural production, it was underground, it was indirect, and it was always part of a political agenda of resistance. It was a means of resisting the regime. But it wasn't a sort of mass popular culture. Usually when we think about this period, we associate it with these two people who are some of the best known Greek artists of the time. Mikis Theodorakis is the composer of music, who was also a leader of the left in the pre-dictatorship period, who is arrested by the regime and after some point is freed, but flees the country, goes to France, and begins a very high-profile combination of resistance and musical performance across the world. And the other person is Melina Mercouri, who also became very well known through the movies in which she played the leading role in the early 1960s. She's in New York when the coup happens, and because she participates in a musical in Broadway and decides to stay out, and also becomes a leading light of resistance. So both Mikis and Melina, who are known by their first names, become sort of global figures of sorts. And when people think of cultural life, they think of those people who were outside the country mobilizing people against the regime. If you look in Greece, this is the poster from a recent exhibit about culture, in which the idea is, again, you see the sort of the motive of darkness, in which the only culture that exists is a culture of political resistance that is always under risk. And so the question is whether that narrative is true. And so I have 4 questions that I want to address in the talk, and which we addressed in the book, about which I'm going to talk about in a moment. The first one is a descriptive question. Was there, by any sort of sense of, any metrics that we have, was there a high quality cultural production during the dictatorship? And if yes, as I'm going to argue, then what explains it? So the second part is really an explanatory one. And then the third part is a sort of meta question. It's about the narratives and the memory of the period. If there was, as we claim in the book, such a period of cultural ferment and a vibrant culture, why is it that we know exactly the opposite? And finally, why do all these things matter? So these are the 4 questions I'm going to discuss today. And this is the book which I'm going to circulate, which is co-authored with a collaborator and friend of mine who is a playwright, who is a director, a theater director. We collaborated on another project of yours, which was a play about the Marshall Plan. And then we started talking about this The origins of this book lie in an observation I made a few years back when I was asked, I think at the 50th anniversary of the Greek dictatorship, I was asked to write something about it. I had never done any proper research on it. And I thought, what kind of puzzles can we come up with about this period? And one of the things that I noticed is that because I like Greek music, a lot of the songs that I happen to like, I realized were produced during that period, which I had never realized. And so initially I thought it was a coincidence, and then I started looking into it, and the more I looked into it, the more I was finding. So I decided, we talked it up with my co-author, Natasha Triadafili, let's look at other areas. And the more we looked into it, the more we found. So what started as the idea of writing perhaps a paper became writing a short book, and then it became a big book. And also an interesting book. So it's a sort of an experiment for me, because there are basically three books into one. So the first part of the book is a sort of public-facing, sort of accessible social science. It's a narrative that looks in the political circumstances of the time to try to understand what explains cultural activity. It's written in a way that's accessible, but at the same time, it's informed by a lot of the social science readings that I've done, even though it's not front-loaded that way. Then there is a second part, which is composed of 11 biographies of cultural producers, songwriters, theater directors, and actors and others who are very active during that period. So what we did was we used a variety of sources, including memoirs, interviews, a number of studies that have been done to provide a more direct sense of what they were thinking and how they were doing what they were doing during that period. It was I discovered a very pleasant exercise. I had never written biographies in my life, and so I really enjoyed that part. And the third part is a sort of reference in which we basically provide the evidence on which the argument is based. And the reason why there is a reference part is because, number one, no one had done it before. And number two, because when you make an argument that's revisionist in nature and kind of shocking, you need to support it. So the third part is, short accounts of different fields, and we cover 5 fields. I'm going to mention those, and then lists of plays, movies, etc. that were produced during that time. It was a very interesting exercise to co-author with someone who's not a social scientist, but is part of the cultural field, and someone who knows the theater scene in Greece very well. And that gave the book this kind of dual nature. And finally, the question is, why write a book in Greek? The problem with this book is that the evidence, which is not just presented the dry way as supporting material, but is also meant to be enjoyed and understood, is very difficult to convey to people who do not know the cultural products of this period. The songs, the singers, the theaters, the plays, the movies. It would be impossible to produce this book in a different language, which raises a very interesting question about the constraints and opportunities you get with these kinds of situations. And also, it's a book that is meant to discuss, people's self-perception of their own country. Why do we think about our own history as Greeks the way we do think? What are the problems and how we can reflect upon it? So that led me to write this book in Greece. It's the first book I've written in which all the research is part of that book and nothing else. I've written in Greek in the past about Greek history or about the Greek Civil War, but the research was always part of other projects as well. So this is the only thing that's exclusively the research is in this book. And also, I'm going to circulate it. We spent a lot of time focusing on book as an object. Since it's a book about culture, we wanted to produce a book that's nice as a product of craft. So we collaborated with a design studio in Thessaloniki. We had a lot of discussions about the aesthetics of the time, and we wanted to produce a book that conveyed those aesthetics, because part of the argument is formulated in an aesthetic way. So we argue that life during the dictatorship was not as bleak, therefore black and white. It was also very colorful. And part of the type of cultural activity of the time was very much influenced by what may be described as the hippie or rock and roll aesthetics and culture, which are based in vivid colors. And so we wanted the book itself to convey our argument that life in Greece was not as miserably deprived of colors, but included, even though you had very unpleasant politics, you also had this kind of contradiction, this paradox, but at the same time, the coexistence of unpleasant politics and very vibrant cultural activity. And so one of the most interesting and most rewarding parts of the experience was that the book itself has been nominated as part of a design award. There is a design association in Greece that includes book production. We hope that we will win. And so the event is next Friday. So I'll let you know how that went. But we're also giving a talk, and I'm going to the award. The name of the award for that is an award which goes to actually not to the book production, but to a person who has contributed in the design scene in Greece. Is named after a designer of that time, and I'm going to show you a couple of his works. Who is also one of these people who are introducing this type of aesthetic in Greece during that period. So this is an example of the kinds of illustrations contained in the book that are meant to convey that kind of contradiction. So what you see are these colorful figures that have the form and the colors of, this kind of late 60s, early 70s figures. There's actually a very nice documentary that is airing right now on Apple TV called 1971, which is about precisely that period. But then in the background, you have black and white pictures of the suppression of the Polytechnic uprising. So essentially, the figures illustrates the coexistence of these two different worlds: the world of political repression on the one hand, and of cultural activity on the other hand, to make the point of coexistence as opposed to mutual exclusion. So let's start with the first question, which is what happened during those years culturally? And let me circulate the book as well to give you a sense of what they meant. It's heavy, which doesn't make it an easy book to pack in your trip. Let me take you back to October 1969, which is about 2.5 years after the coup. And this is a record that is circulates at that time by a Greek singer-songwriter whose name is Dionysis Savopoulos, and whose production is by a designer named Asterios Delialis, the designer that I just mentioned. And you can see the kind of aesthetics of the time. It's called The Garden, the Fool's Garden. And it's a book by which this singer-songwriter, who used to be a person just singing on a guitar, who was quite well known before the dictatorship, becomes really a very big star and transition into rock and roll. So he changes his style, he introduces electrical sound, and becomes a very big star, becomes incredibly successful. And October 1969 is a key date for reasons that I'm going to explain. He plays in a nightclub in central Athens named Rodeo, which becomes center of a lot of cultural activity. He becomes super successful, and I think that illustrates a renewal, not just a continuity. And so we need to explain what happens in the 2 years before that and why things change in 1969. And so the first point I want to make is that we cannot understand the period of the dictatorship as a homogeneous period, which is very often an understanding that people have, that it's a sort of monolithic period in which things in 1967 are very much the same as in 1974. There are broadly two distinct periods. The first one are the first 2 years, which actually correspond to the perception that people have of a situation in which things are pretty much silent. The writers, for example, a lot of writers decide to not to write and not to publish as a way to resist against or to express their disagreement with the period. And also the cultural field, to use Bourdieu's term, is disorganized because a lot of people have left, especially established people have left and are living in self-imposed exile in other countries. And so this is a period that corresponds pretty much to the perception that we have about the dictatorship. But then in 1969, there is a relaxation of controls that takes place. And at the same time, a new group of people, including people like Savopoulos, who are younger, they are between 25 and 40, break in and start to become well-known. And this is true of all the different fields. And it's part of our explanation as well. The key institutional move is the replacement of so-called preemptive censorship by something which is called suppressive censorship. And you would expect that suppressive censorship is actually worse than preemptive one. But that actually means a lot because under the initial regime, every cultural product has to be submitted to the authorities and be vetted and approved before it can be published. Whereas under the second regime, you can publish everything that you want, but if it gets rejected, you may face legal penalties. So the onus is on the producers as opposed to the regime, and you would think that this would make the production process more dangerous or risky, but in fact, it operates in a very different way, and it allows people to become more forthcoming with what they have and want to publish. Then I would argue that the peak of this period is a period that has been forgotten in Greece, which is a period of attempted liberalization by the regime. The regime tries to organize a transition very much in the general kind of frame of the so-called negotiated transitions, the examples we have in places like Spain or Poland, that eventually fails after a student uprising triggers a hardliner coup in November 1973 and ends that period. The cultural life continues afterwards, but what has been lost is a lot of this kind of dynamism that is very obvious in the period beforehand. And what is very interesting, I don't expect you to read that, is you have instances of direct criticism of the regime during that period of liberalization that were quite unexpected because the standard idea is that this liberalization process was meant to fail, was stillborn, which is sort of an ex post facto interpretation. But what we found when we did our research was that there was a big opening in terms of what could be published and what could be said, including official opposition against a referendum that was organized in 1973, again, the no, which corresponds to the 2015 one, in which actually in Athens, even though we know that there was the referendum was rigged, but in Athens, the proportion of anti-regime votes was very high, and in some areas, it actually won against the proposed regime's option. So when people speak about the stunting or the limitations to cultural life, they usually refer to censorship. And censorship is a sort of key analytical move to explain why cultural life couldn't be successful. And it turns out that the reality is much more complicated because what we found was happening is people equated the presence of censorship with the effectiveness of censorship. They assumed that the regime was able to effectively repress cultural productions through censorship, when the reality is different. First of all, what is very interesting is that, and I'm not going to go into details, is that censorship had a long history, not just in Greece, in almost every country. It was perceived as part of the natural landscape of things. And so people were used to dealing with different forms of censorship, even before the dictatorship. The second element is that, like every bureaucratic procedure, things never work exactly as they're intended to. The third thing, which they very interestingly call an R&R process, for those of us who are in academia, it was never meant to be a final decision-making process. There was always bargaining going on. People would go or would be called when, say, a record came out they would have to submit, say, the lyrics of their songs, and there would be, some things that were struck out. Well, they had the opportunity to go back to correct. So they used a variety of creative strategies. Very often they put a lot of outrageous things into their songs so that they could get those struck out and keep the things they really cared about. But there is also a very interesting process as well that people, especially in literary criticism, poetry, and other fields, have described as creative repurposing, in which people very often use the obstacles that are inherent in censorship practices to develop a language that is much more artistic and therefore of higher quality. And that was the case, for example, with someone like Savopoulos. His language is very allegorical, very indirect, and as a result, extremely resistant to time, to fashions and times. You can listen to the songs today, and they sound as fresh as they did then because they don't have that kind of very literal quality that a lot of other works would have. And so the bottom line, and there is an entire chapter that looks into censorship practices, is that not only it was not the sort of incredible obstacle that people make it to be, but very often it acted in ways that unintentionally helped reorient cultural production in a more interesting direction. And so I'm going to cover the 5 different fields very briefly. So the first field we look at is both books and publishing, so the content of the publishing industry, but also its form. We look at fiction, books, nonfiction, and poetry. And we find, for example, some surprising findings. It's the first time we have a book about Macronissos. Macronissos was an island of exile for the leftists in the Greek Civil War. So the first book to be written about that experience in a literary form was published during that time. And also, it's the time in which one of the best-known Greek novels becomes a bestseller. It's called The Third Wrath of Aristophanes during that time. And also, it's a time in which a lot of left-wing poets and writers get published very successfully, which people forget about because in the initial period, a lot of those people were sent to internal exile, usually in islands, and couldn't publish their work. But after 1970, they come back to the publishing field, and we show that they become incredibly successful. But the thing that is really interesting is also the publishing industry booms. We have a rise in the number of books published, in the number of publishers, in the number of bookstores, and the readers. And of course, we have a boom in Marxist books, which is also very interesting because the regime was a right-wing regime. So you would expect them not to allow these types of books. And a lot of people believe that those books were forbidden. So there are lots of references to books being forbidden. But if you look at the titles that are published, all the classics, but all the arcane books about various Marxist debates, Trotskyites versus others, etc., get published during this period. And also, parallel to that, you have an explosion in the lifestyle press, and also the so-called pocket books, books that are sold by that are very cheap, sometimes books of very high quality, classics, Balzac, and famous authors who get published and sold for at very cheap prices from kiosks. And also you get, I forgot to tell you that Mikis Theodorakis' music was forbidden. You couldn't listen to it, but his books actually were free, so he could write and be published, and that illustrates the sort of contradictory nature of censorship practices. The book on the right is a book that was published in Britain about student organizing, which was instrumental in facilitating and spurring student organization after 1972 in Greece. And also, Mikis Theodorakis is very present. He gives interviews to Greek newspapers. He advocates for a variety of things. He cannot accuse the regime in direct terms. He cannot go out against the regime in direct terms. And he says things that are pretty, openly political in many ways about his intentions and about his preferences, which you wouldn't expect to see in a press that's under censorship control, which was also quite surprising. And this on the left is the first magazine published about cars, and on the right, Albert Camus, The Stranger, which was part of this kind of cheap kiosk type publications. Theater is also a place in which there's a lot of experimentation, but also mainstream theater. You get very good productions of a lot of high quality, very well regarded plays. But what is extremely interesting is the avant-garde boom during the time. You have a troupe, for example, that experiments with collective direction of theaters, and it's called free theater, electro theater, and this is a poster of that group, and they become very successful, and they actually put up a number of productions in which they indirectly criticize the regime, and of course everyone understands those critiques, even though they do not name names. We have in cinema the rise of the so-called New Greek cinema, which is a sort of auteur artistic cinema that is very much influenced by Italian neorealism and French cinema of the time. And in the state-sponsored Cinema Festival of Thessaloniki in 1972, you've got the leaders of this movement winning all, the first prizes. People like Theo Angelopoulos, some of you may know him, but also others. At the same time, however, you have this very steep decline of commercial cinema that used to be very successful at the time, producing mostly so-called lowbrow type of commercial movies. And that is due to the rise of television, and it's a sort of uniform process across Europe. Angelopoulos produces at the time a movie that is about the Metaxas dictatorship in 1936. So he uses a former dictatorship to critique the present dictatorship without naming the present dictatorship. And it's considered one of the first explicitly political movies in Greek cinema. And these are the people who won the prizes in 1972 in the Thessaloniki Film Festival, who become probably the most famous filmmakers in Greece during that time, and who are also very politically radical in terms of outlook. Music is probably the most interesting field. I said that this is what triggered the book. This is a very creative period for Greek music, and what is interesting, it covers all the bases from songs that are quite political to songs that are very commercial but high quality. I'm not going to go through that, and this is the difficulty of discussing these artists for an audience that does not know them. It's also a period in which pop and rock and roll music really explode in Greece. And what is very interesting as an indirect but very powerful, I think, indicator of the quality of the production of the time is a lot of the songs that were produced then are still very popular today. So they have won this, the battle against time, which is not easy to get. This is a music composer, there is Yanis Markopoulos, who was introducing a sort of traditionalist music trend, using traditional forms and infusing them with highly political lyrics. This is the music club in which Savopoulos, whom I showed you initially, was performing. And these are some images of those records, which I think convey both the quality but also the high diversity of music production at the time. You can see a variety of different forms, a variety of different styles. What I cannot convey, of course, is the enduring popularity of the songs that were included in those records. One of the things that I always enjoyed doing during the process of writing this book was telling people that these songs were produced during that time. It always causes for a small shock. The same is true for the art scene, especially painting. Lots of exhibitions, very sort of active scene. And so throughout these 5 fields, books, cinema, theater, music, and art, we have what is arguably an extremely vibrant and very successful field of cultural activity. So the main sort of takeaway is that it was a good time to be in culture. And one of the things that we do in the book, which I think is original, is we examine both the highbrow and the lowbrow, more commercial aspects of culture to show that in both areas we had high quality production. And it's also a time in which we have the emergence of fields of economic activity that are directly linked to culture, such as advertising, for example, or design. These are the times in which we get a lot of these kinds of developments. The most important thing that's worth emphasizing is all this activity happens openly. It's not an underground activity, but it's very public, very popular. Thousands of people attend the concerts and theater plays and the cinema performances. And that, I think, constitutes a kind of context which is, the book brings to life. This is by that designer, Stathis. It's a cover for a product at the time, which I think was never published, but it was part of his personal collection. And it's very interesting that it depicts the year 1972 in a way that is extremely consistent with what may be described as a sort of hippie-type aesthetics that were very common at the time. There is often a perception that Greece was sealed from the outside world and was not communicating that a lot of the developments that took place in the West never made it to Greece because of the dictatorship. But what we found was, in fact, there was much more communication and much more activity than we thought. So the question is then why, which is, having established this kind of activity, why did it take place? How can we explain it? I think one has to start with the scope condition, which is general, which is that even though this was a repressive regime, and even though this was a regime that punished in very sort of repressive ways the people who turned against it, who organized resistance activities against it, using torture, for example. As far as its general level of repression goes, it probably was ranking on the low end. And I think it would be difficult to imagine a situation in which you have a regime that's uniformly repressive, consistently repressive. I don't think that's compatible with cultural activity, especially culture of high quality. So you have to have that as a sort of scope condition. The other thing that makes a difference is the presence of the market that allows cultural producers to operate and make a living without being connected to the state. So a market that allows them to derive a livelihood and therefore creates the conditions for the existence and creates a space for them to produce. So these are general scope conditions, and within them you can find also, probably comparatively speaking, a lot of variation in terms of what you find. So what we do, we identify 4 effects that explain our observation. The first are regime independent, are things that would have happened no matter what. And the 2 other ones are connected with the regime, even though they're unintended effects. And those have implications for the counterfactual. If we want to imagine a counterfactual, what would cultural life have been in the absence of the dictatorship? The first 2 points to a situation in which there would have been a cultural boom of the same sort, the other 2 not. So the first one is obviously a socioeconomic effect. It's the most obvious thing to reflect. These are times in which the GDP per capita in Greece grows very fast, times of modernization, urbanization, the expansion of tertiary education, rise of a new urban middle class. People want to consume. There is a boom, for example, people buy bookcases. They buy encyclopedias because they want to show that they're educated. And so there is quite a lot of that, and that gets channeled through the cultural market as well. And this would have been is irrelevant, is it unconnected to the regime? Probably the most probable thing to imagine is the same dynamic would have happened irrespective of political developments and perhaps the same outcomes as well. What is very interesting is the extent to which Greek society changes between 67 and 74 in a way that is not often acknowledged in literature because of the assumption that it's a homogeneous and monolithic period. And so the best way to illustrate that is to show you pictures of some of the artists. So this is one of the most famous Greek singers up to today, George Dallaras, and this is his first record in 1969. So he looks very clean cut.
I was in London a few days ago.
Yeah,
singing there.
Okay. And this is his record in 71. You see a very different kind. It's not just his hair that grows, but also the style that changes. He's not the clean cut, sort of direct looking straight person. He's much more tortured intellectual, right? And this is the 74 version, which is basically the style he acquires ever since. This is Savopoulos, the guy I mentioned at the beginning, in 1965. And this is Savopoulos in 1970. So only 5 years separate those two pictures, but the 65 version looks like the grandfather of the 1970 version. So you see, the change. And again, it's not just the way you look, but the way you pose, the kinds of ideas that you sort of channel. This is a famous Greek singer of popular songs, Kazantzidis, but the reason I put it up is because his wife is singing next to him, Marinella, and she was complaining that her husband never let her sing on her own. So she gets a divorce in 1966, almost disappears, and then re-emerges in 69 as a sort of showbiz diva, incredibly successful. And you see, again, a person that belongs almost to the first half of the 20th century versus a person who could have been extremely, looks very contemporary to us. And this is the first record of a live performance in a club, in a music club, that she pioneered. What is very interesting about Marinella is in 1972, she has an affair with a married Greek businessman, gets pregnant and has a baby, and then splits from him and gets a relationship and eventually gets married to the guy on the right, who is the most famous Greek singer of the time. So you've got the most famous Greek singer, male and female, together, and they do not hide the fact that the baby is an out-of-wedlock baby with a married person, and the singer, Voskopoulos, decides to also adopt the baby. So you get attitudes and values that reflect a very big change in what is accepted in social mores that I think would have been very difficult to make sense otherwise. So this tremendous change happens to happen during that period, I think. So the main line here is that culture was a sort of general expression of this sense of opportunity and optimism that followed this, incredible economic development and change, reflected rising expectations, and also signal a change in values and the emergence of individualism over older collective identities. This is going to materialize very clearly in the period of the transition, after the transition to democracy, but it's, I think, and that is another contribution of the book, is the argument that these processes are very visible, culturally speaking, under the dictatorship. They do not start in 1974, they've started before. So in a way, society is moving faster than politics, which creates, obviously, a lot of frictions. And one can think about political implications. Now, the second mechanism, which is independent of the regime, is this broad cultural shift after May 68, which is present everywhere in the West, post-Vietnam, in which you get precisely this kind of aesthetics, this kind of force, this kind of creative innovation that really has a very big effect. And unlike what some people have argued about Greece, it really comes to Greece very powerfully. And one very interesting channel for which a lot of these ideas and values arrive in Greece is through tourism. And this is the first, one of the most successful pop records of the period, which is sold in a bag made out of this traditional material. people have, you have a lot of these groups that are on, in the magazines. There is a sense that the dictatorship forbade, long cure, etc., which was true at the beginning, but certainly completely out of reality during the 70s. A lot of these groups that look very similar to the groups that you have in other countries. Hippie culture becomes very active, and this is perhaps the first selfie in Greece. This is a guy who became a music producer. And this is the day after the Polytechnic School uprising with his girlfriend and his sister. The only thing that tells you it's a picture from the time is the transistor radio in front of them. Otherwise, it could be a picture from today. I find it quite amazing because it shows exactly how this transition to a society that, at least in the urban centers, looks very much like a contemporary society happens during those times. The third one, which I think is the most interesting theoretically mechanism, is the substitution effect, which is that because political parties are no longer present, they free a tremendous amount of public space that becomes de facto occupied by the cultural sphere. So cultural producers become a focal point in society in which they attract a lot of attention and at the same time attract a lot of resources and energy, which then allows them to produce at a higher level and be, I think, more creative and more successful. And this is an unintended effect which suggests how, under some conditions, the absence of a partisan political sphere means that politics takes place in culture, and therefore allows culture to develop its appeal and its strength in society. And then there is a gatekeeping effect. I think it's a smaller effect, but it's very interesting, and it comes out a lot of testimonials. The fact that the parties of the left, which acted as political gatekeepers for a lot of cultural products, are no longer present, which allows people, even, most of these artists are leftists, but they're leftists of a different kind. This is the first time that you have the rise of far left movements, Maoists and Trotskyites and others, who under the previous conditions were very much repressed by the traditional Communist Party. And so you have a space that opens up, and people who are much more willing to be independent and take risks, and also a younger generation that fills the space of the people who are no longer in Greece. So people like Markopoulos, for example, becomes the new Theodorakis because Theodorakis is not present, and that allows for much more space for them. So these are the four mechanisms who operate in ways that in a sense, reinforce each other. And the third question I would like to address before concluding with another question is why, given this effervescence, given this rich activity, this vibrancy of culture, why is the narrative in Greece today that nothing really worthwhile took place, or to the extent that there was cultural activity, it was marginal, and it was primarily political? What is very interesting is when you look carefully at a lot of descriptive accounts of the time, you find the following type of description in which things are described in the frame of an exceptionalism. That is, perhaps, this great record was produced during the time of the dictatorship, but that was an exception. That was exceptional. But of course, when you put all the exceptions together, you get a very, very powerful pattern. The second thing is that in various academic fields, you have research indicating and supporting this idea of very vibrant cultural activity. For example, there are a couple of papers looking at the publishing field, making the case that political books and Marxist books were very successful during the time. But again, these are not connected to other fields. So there is a sort of silo. People who work on publishing do not speak to people who work on music, and so on and so forth. And it's not connected to a broader account. And again, one gets the sense that these are exceptional sort of occurrences, that we do not have a thing, that they never somehow gel together. And as a result, they haven't really affected the general perception. But then the question is, where did that general perception of cultural darkness come from? Uh, and it's very interesting that, in a sense, the publication of this book is a sort of experiment. They didn't design it as such because people get a sense of shock when they see the title, because they had never heard of a time of cultural activity, and they very often think that this is a book that tries to rehabilitate the dictatorship, when in fact the argument is that all these things happen in spite of the dictatorship. So why was this period forgotten? And why did the narrative of darkness, of uniform darkness, emerge? Well, initially it emerged because in the initial phase of the transition to democracy, the new regime was very fragile. So you needed a very powerful pushback against the dictatorship, which also expressed a lot of pent-up frustration against the regime as well, and which makes a lot of sense. But I think that it was sustained by a combination of guilt and opportunism. Guilt because the reality in Greece is that resistant activities were very, very limited, very marginal. And that created a very powerful sense of guilt, a bit like what happened in France after the Second World War. People didn't feel proud about, the absence of resistance. And then the second one was a wave of opportunism in which many poor people claimed to have been resistance, very much like France, when in fact they didn't do much. And so that created a sense of a narrative that needed to sustain this perception of the period of the dictatorship being incredibly repressive, and in which nobody could do anything. It's not easy also for artists in that kind of context in which this narrative is dominating to discuss how creative they were during the dictatorship. So they've always emphasized the kinds of obstacles they faced, whether they had been arrested. They gave a lot of emphasis on what they couldn't do rather than what they did, because it was not easy for them to describe that. But by doing that, they had to negate a lot of what made them incredibly creative and successful. And so the conclusion of the book looks at the transition as a form of traumatic experience for people who cannot speak openly about this kind of contradictory things, because the majority of the artists were opposed to the regime, but at the same time, they didn't engage in open resistance against it. And they were very successful in a sort of symbiotic way with the regime. And that, I think, becomes, through repetition, perceived as a reality, and then creates that kind of perception that nothing else happened. So that is our explanation for why the perception of reality is so different from the actual reality, which is, in and of itself, I think, a very interesting kind of implication. And it has implications for theories about how post-authoritarian states and societies deal with the past. And final question, why does it matter? I'm going to conclude. In the case of Greece, I think, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of this research project was how fun it was to research, because the story is so surprising and so fascinating. I think it is it allows us to think more deeply and more accurately about recent Greek history, and also to think about these kinds of questions of collective memory and political legacy. And also, I think it allows us, even from a political perspective, to reclaim a period that is very easily conceded to the authoritarian regime. People say, well, the regime was more powerful and able to control everything in society, whereas our account shows that there were dynamics in society that bypassed, that the regime was not able to penetrate society, or perhaps not even interested in doing that, which allowed society to operate in ways that were not, that were surprisingly free from regime constraints at the time. At the same time, there is a very interesting outcome, which I didn't expect when we started this project, which is a very interesting blind spot that exists in our understanding of the period, which is that almost all the literature focus on the regime and the opposition to the regime. There is almost a sort of very strong political bias. There is very little social history or sociology, accounts of what happens in society during that time. And what I call the sleeping beauty assumption that the Greek society was to sleep and wakes up in 1974, almost unchanged and unaffected. And I think that points to a very interesting area that is not really well serviced, not just in Greek history, but more generally about social dynamics during dictatorships. There is now a lot of work on existing authoritarian regimes, but there isn't as much work on past authoritarian regimes, especially the areas that were not necessarily completely overlapping with political activities. And so I think that there are some interesting comparative questions that emerge. First of all, there's a general question about variation. Under what conditions are we likely to observe these kinds of dynamics under authoritarianism? And also understanding how actual societies really deal with constraints and political repression. And from a methodological perspective, there's an interesting area of research in political science, which is about the long-term legacies of various bad, we sort of trace the effects of bad things that happened in the past to the present, especially after centuries. But I think a sort of problem with this kind of literature is because we only care about the effect of a variable and the impact of some sort of treatment on some outcome, we are not paying enough attention. Actual process that corresponds in the middle. Very often we treat it at best as a mechanism, something that is supposed to link and give meaning to a causal effect. But I think the real interesting dimension here is to uncover all this very rich set of processes which connect a treatment to its outcome and where the real action is. I think we've made a very bad service to research in politics by throwing out of the window the very rich elements that constitute the processes that connect cause and effect. Just because we believe that we can establish in a sort of rigorous and precise way a connection between cause and effect. And I do think that by immersing ourselves into the actual process, we understand things much better. Whereas very often, even when we establish a cause and effect, we have the illusion of understanding what connects them. And also another field that is, I think, very underserved in political science is culture. We don't really study culture very well, very often because culture is so fluid and difficult to grasp or to quantify. We tend to think that perhaps we can bypass it, that culture is epiphenomenal. Political science is very Marxist in that respect because we treat culture as epiphenomenal to more fundamental, deeper causes that we need to identify. But one of the things that I became very convinced because I hadn't studied culture before this project is that culture is very endogenous. It creates a lot of things. It shapes realities in ways that are surprising and unexpected. And again, one of the themes that comes out of this project is, the host of unintended effects that are illustrated, how a lot of what happened was not the result of the intention either of the cultural producers themselves or the political regime. So that's a sort of very quick and dirty summary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I assigned myself, since we don't have a discussant, and I did go through the book, and I did put some points down because I thought that you did raise so many interesting issues there, and I've got some critical points as well, of course, and if you would like to respond to them as well. Also looking at your topic or from a broader perspective too. And continuing to what you said, why does it matter? I think that your book really matters because first of all, you challenge the simplistic narratives, the bad dictatorship, nothing happened.
No, but the dictatorship was bad. There's no question about it.
But also that nothing's happening, during those kinds of periods of dark times. It also restores agency to society. It's a bottom-up approach. When we study dictatorships, we usually look at them from a top-down perspective. It connects Greece also with global cultural trends, as you showed. It shows that repression and creativity can coexist. It contributes to memory debates and memory studies. Some also, in our age, might also feel nostalgic for some of these cultural kind of events there. It is interdisciplinary. Very, very interesting that you wrote this with a cultural scholar or a cultural practitioner, rather. And it's also good that you reminded us that this was not a monolithic period. Indeed, in my work on the Greek dictatorship, I studied education in particular, and it was very clear to me that the first phase of the dictatorship up until 1970-71 was the repressive part of it, and then it really needed to start liberalizing. And that liberalization one could see as well in the field of education, which I studied, how they started kind of introducing laws that were much more liberal. And what is even more interesting is that during the final year of the dictatorship, under Ioannidis, who was the more repressive kind of dictator to the previous liberal phase, they actually introduced some really interesting and revolutionary education laws. And they happened during that period after the Polytechnic. I then wanted to ask you some things that maybe you could very briefly kind of address. First of all, a methodological point in your work. In other words, how do you measure cultural flourishing? Because that's difficult to kind of measure. When do we see a big bang? Also, in that kind of methodology, there is a selection bias as well. In terms of choosing the particular personalities that you chose, and maybe even an urban elitist bias, because we are talking about Athens, Thessaloniki, those kind of centers of Greek cultural social life. But what about, the rest of Greece? What about the rest of cultural events that were happening beyond those kinds of individuals that you kind of... so that's my first point. My second point, which for me is very, very interesting, is how do we understand this connection between power and culture? Does this tell us about, a society that independently kind of appears to be, flourishing in the cultural field? And what does it tell us about the regime itself? Because again, in my study, when I was looking at the ideology of the regime, I did a clear kind of distinction between ideology, as that was kind of professed by the fascist regimes of the interwar period, and mentalities, which is much more relevant to what the military rulers in Greece or Latin America, who didn't have any kind of ideological orientation whatsoever. Indeed, some of them, like in the Greece case, they came to the ridiculous point of expressing what they really believe. So what I was thinking is, to what degree these two kind of are interconnected as well? On the one degree, how much does the junta itself allow for this environment? But at the same time, how the two meet as well? Because there was at the same time an interconnectedness between that kind of top-down and the bottom-up. And while you were showing all this, hippie culture and how people were changing in terms of their appearance and everything, I kept on thinking to myself that that was also part of junta's intention. When it was promoting the tourism of Greece, it was very colorful, bringing, people from abroad to come and see all, In fact, tourism, as we know it even now, it started back then, right, in that particular period. That kind of commercialism of the regime that really allowed for this kind of, culture to flourish. So there is a kind of connectivity between the two. In fact, and you mentioned in your book as well, some of the artists that you speak about, they did appear in regime concerts, like Discussant. You mentioned that in your book. Yeah. So that is where you've got that kind of interconnectedness, which blurs a little bit the picture and, makes me think the connection between power and politics. I've got another point, and that is about the risk of revisionism. And I'm sure that you must have, discussed that in Greece a lot, because obviously by looking at this, sometimes either in a kind of a positive light of how culture was allowed to kind of operate for one reason or another, there is a risk of looking at those kind of really dark kind of places, because at the end of the day, they are dark. Even if you've got, that culture which comes as a point of resistance or in an autonomous kind of way, they are particularly dark. So I'm not so sure that, it was a good time, to do culture in those years. Maybe it was a necessity for them in order to survive or whatever. And final point to this is, going back to my first one, is that if we look at it and how do we kind of see that it was flourishing, isn't it more accurate to say that that particular period was a period of transition rather than a period of, a boom of culture? Transition where, new kind of people emerged, like the ones that you showed, that after 1974, they even express themselves even more, that because, music, you're right. But then I was thinking the cinema in particular. There was a commercial cinema of the 1960s that was very, very kind of popular, and people who really go to the cinemas. But what we are seeing in that kind of transition period is that you've got the art cinema coming in, the commercial cinema being completely suppressed. So you've got fewer directors, most of them are arty directors or something, and people don't go to the cinemas anymore. They stop going. So, that's more of a transition rather than, as a boom in a culture. These are the points that made me think about your book. I mean, it was really, really excellent, but I'm also really
thanks. Obviously, thank you very much. Also, these are key questions, and a lot of them do not have a definite answer. A lot of them have to be treated as the beginnings of conversations. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was to open a conversation about this period, because it's a period that is not really discussed. People posit certain things and then keep repeating them. So it feels, it's not it's a very uncreative period, a type of discussion for a very creative period. So even if, the contribution of this book is to open up these kinds of questions, I think that is always a good thing to do. So the first question on establishing the fact that there was culture, a cultural sort of flourishing. There are some metrics that I mentioned, which, we didn't do the measuring, but we could easily, which is, say, the number of bookstores or the number of theater companies. And we reference some of that evidence. So there are a number of ways to establish quantitative elements, and I think that would show that there is a development of various fields. But I think the most important one is the qualitative dimension. The fact that there was a high quality dimension in that culture, and that comes from a lot of people who specialize in those fields, who very often look at this period in the margins of other projects, and who very often also emphasize the quality of certain cultural products. As I said before, in certain areas, especially when the products are still accessible, such as songs, it's very easy to establish the incredible popularity of a very large number of songs. But again, it would be possible perhaps to measure that over time, and one would find that the early 60s are a very good time for music. The second part of the 60s not. Even after 65, there is a decline. And I would say the period 70 to 74 is incredibly productive, and then there is a decline, which we discuss in the conclusion. So it's possible to do a purely quantitative account, but I think the evidence is pretty powerful. It's difficult to challenge in terms of both the quantity and the quality of what is being produced. And the reason why we have this reference part in the book is precisely to indicate that. But of course, there are ways to do that more systematically as well. So on the urban bias, of course, I mean, culture is primarily something that takes place in the two major cities, Athens and Thessaloniki. There is much less going on outside of the cities. But that is true of culture in general, I would say. It is primarily geared to big urban centers and much less present elsewhere. What is very interesting is that at the time, Greece almost reaches the point in which its urbanization is completed, in which about 50% of the population lives in those two major cities. So I think by discussing urban life, one covers a pretty large percentage of the Greek population. There is a cultural product that reaches everyone in a way that is quite controversial, which we not discuss, and this is television. This is the time in which television becomes very popular, and almost every household in the country acquires a television monitor. One of the reasons we didn't deal with television is because there's almost no television studies. It's a completely ignored area of investigation.
And it was controlled at the time.
Yes, it was controlled. There were two channels, and it was a major conduit of propaganda. But I'm sure that if we were to look at it systematically, we would find the same kinds of openings, not as much as outside, because it's a very controlled environment. But I think we would be surprised by the extent to which things could be said, even on television, that we didn't expect to see, very much like in newspapers. On the second question, the relationship between power and culture, of course, there is a sort of implicit social contract in which the regime tells society, you can do whatever you want except turn against us. And society then says, we're going to say whatever we want in an indirect way. And there is a famous scene in which the director, Theo Angelopoulos, presents his movie about the Metaxas dictatorship, which is very clearly a critique of the regime. It uses a past dictatorship to criticize the present dictatorship. And so in the first screening, there is a person in the audience who gets up and says, did we understand what we understood? And he replies, yes. And the whole room erupts in applause. So there is agency in this kind of relationship. It's not a naive and sort of passive understanding. And of course,
that has to do with Angelopoulos as well, who's long and
yes,
protracted, and you can stay for hours.
But a lot of songs are very thinly veiled in terms of their message, and it's quite surprising to see what they could get away with. But it is a social contract that has a lot of unpredictable and unintended dimensions because. Of course, the regime wants, people to be consumed by private pleasures as opposed to by collective projects. But at the same time, it's precisely the rise of youth culture and of hippie culture that would lead in some, and culture itself that would lead to the radicalization of the youth that produces the Polytechnic school uprising. So it backfires to the dictatorship. So it's not the kind of clean-cut deal in which everyone gets exactly what they're expecting. So I think the picture and this kind of deal is much more nuanced eventually than any actor expected. The question of revisionism. Well, of course, I mean, you have, I think, part of the reason why people have had this very sort of fearful, sort of perception of the dictatorship in the way, very careful way of dealing with it, is very much colored by the initial concern about the potential instability of democracy. But I think that after 60 years of democratic continuity, I don't think, we are at a position in which we can actually speak much more openly about this period and with much less concern that anything that would depart from the original narrative would actually place, things in danger. I think that even, people who are on the far right today in Greece are not willing to promote their ideas by supporting the dictatorship. So the dictatorship has really no supporters. And so it's very difficult to see how, and I also think that the style, the military dictatorship, and the content of that dictatorship are completely orthogonal with what makes the far right model popular today. And so I don't think that that can work politically in a way that is dangerous in any form or fashion. And I think there's something liberating about describing reality in its own terms as opposed to covering things up and owning up and opening up conversations that are normative about, for example, the question of resistance and its absence, and seeing both sides of the equation.
Shall we allow
Yes.
some questions?
Yeah.
Because I saw Sandra and I'm
Yes.
sure others as well, so let's take them. Yeah, okay. Let's take 3, right?
Yes.
And then allow for another round. Excellent. Sandra.
So thanks so much. I found it so interesting. So my first question, it taps into some of the things you have already mentioned, which is what is the evidence you may have gathered of why the military regime accepted this? So it seems to me that there might be three different types of reasons. One is capacity. Basically, when they change regulation from preemptive to suppressive censorship, the production was bigger and therefore they struggled to control more. The second one is that they thought it was inconsequential. Basically, that wasn't important, that wasn't threatening because, as you said, resistance was very low. And the third one is that it's, sort of, and you also hinted at this, that there was a sort of agreement that they would allow, that there was a strategy considered that they would allow this opening in the cultural realm in exchange for keeping, the regime in a way, control in the political realm. So that's my first question. So what kind of evidence have you gathered related to the position of the people who were really in the country? The second is about the takeaway of the whole thing, because you have convinced me that it was not a period of darkness, okay? But that's very different to say, that the regime didn't have any effect, because if culture was in the early 70s blooming everywhere, the counterfactual would be, in Greece, if the regime hadn't been present, then, the cultural life would have been even more important or more flourishing, which means that the regime may have had an effect. So, what is the takeaway of the whole story, right? And that also ties in with the comparison of this cultural production with other countries, because that would allow us to see, well, yeah, there were a lot of things done. That was certainly not a period of darkness, but certainly Greece compares, not very favorable against countries with similar conditions, etc. That comparison would allow us to see, that production in more relative terms.
Let's go more. Maria.
So thanks a lot for the presentation. It was fascinating. So I just wanted to ask you about the 4 factors that you were mentioning to where orthogonal to the regime. So, but then the one that, in a way, that it connects somehow to Sandra's question, but so the fact that there was this socioeconomic boom puts the case also in perspective in ways that I was wondering if you are thinking about that when you think about maybe possibly comparing this to other cases, and that whether, because I do not know enough of the period, whether there was an economic, whether the economy at some point became an undermining factor for the regime, and so how that plays together, the fact that the culture was booming because socioeconomically there was this boom that was more long term, but whether the short term of the economy at some point plays or not a role, and how does that compare to other, or to the standard understanding of how economics plays in regime resistance or upheavals or whatever.
Were there hands at the back?
There was one here.
Okay. Yes, Kira.
Great, thank you so much. I was familiar with a lot of it, but I really enjoyed your remarks and kind of they made me get thinking bigger remarks about culture. I mean, I know it because I've heard you talk about before about the book, but I was very interested in your remarks about the relation, the study of culture and political science. And I think kind of picking up from the thread of the previous question, in the end, what do you think the effect of this cultural boom was on politics? Was it that it actually subdued resistance because people were happy and they found meaning in their life and they went to tavernas and they sang with their friends and they weren't grumpy and so they just got on with it and didn't kind of, I don't know, somehow make the life of the regime impossible? Or was it that they kind of formed new collectivities and that led to it? But like that, these were probably both of these things were true, right? So like maybe kind of small groups formed new collectivities that started resistance, but the big picture was one where possibly the cultural boom subdued actually resistance against the regime.
And David, shall we take?
Yes, let's
one?
take the fourth
Yeah.
one and then
Yeah.
try to combine them.
Also, I will get another four. Yes, I'll take yours then. Yes, yeah, and then we'll go for the next one.
I was trying to think how this compares to the end of Soviet Union in these countries. And one thing there was that I think people who, because there was a cultural production as well, but one thing there was that people kind of felt that things are about to change. So I'm curious, when you were studying these kind of figures, what did they think about the future, like nearby political future? Did they think that they live in a period where it was going to be for quite a while? Or did they think that they live in a period that's going to be on a cusp of change?
Well, let me start with this final question. It's very interesting when you read both recollections, but also evidence from, say, correspondence. People write to each other. What you find is that there is no relationship between the duration of the regime and people's expectations. So at the initial period, a lot of people think the regime is going to collapse very quickly. And at the end, a lot of people believe that it's never going to collapse. So it's very interesting to see how we are unable to predict. And in fact, there is a movement of return that is not very well known. But after 1972, a lot of people started returning, artists started returning to Greece, who left because they thought they wanted to fight against the regime. And even Mikis Theodorakis himself is considering returning. And if the liberalization process was not interrupted, he would have returned. I mean, he's very clear about his intention. So it's not clear to see, again, a linear relationship between expectations and culture. It seems to be not clearly related or not linearly related, which also takes me, to Kiras' question, which is, what is the effect of culture on politics? I would say both. I mean, on the one hand, it is, people, especially one has to take into account the period before the dictatorship, in which there was crisis upon crisis. A lot of people, at least in what they write at the time, report being very tired of, high political intensity. And so they welcome, the fact that politics plays less of a role. But that after some point, they feel that they want to have a voice. They want to have politics play the same kind of role. And you see how eventually, after 1973, especially during the liberalization period, there is a lot of repoliticization happening very quickly. So it's not clear, and I'm not sure. In political science, very often we want to have very clean effects, but I'm not sure how useful that is, because this assumption of ceteris paribus analytically makes sense, but empirically does not, because we cannot really clean everything up the way we could clean things in experimental contexts. One of the features that makes politics so fascinating is a lot of things are happening together. Of course, you don't want to tell a story in which everything affects everything else, but at the same time, I think it's equally utopian to expect that you're going to be able to separate everything very cleanly, the way you can separate chemical, reactions in the laboratory. So you have to be analytical without having the illusion that you can actually isolate effects in a way that's very clean. So the socioeconomic boom and how does it work? I mean, if you look at democracies that experience booming periods, you also see variation. So it's not the case that you are seeing only periods of surprisingly high quality production because the economy is doing well and because there is freedom. Very often that's associated with very poor quality kind of commercial type culture. So when I looked at the literature, I couldn't find something that was very helpful in that respect, because in general, when we think about culture in the social sciences, we do not think about the production of art. We think about behavior, the norms of behavior. This is the, how the term culture gets deployed in the social sciences, as opposed to the production of, say, music, theater, and what have you. So it's a very underdeveloped field, and we don't really have a good sense of, what may be some, general points. But I would say there's a lot of variation, and it's not clear that having a socioeconomic boom in and of its own is going to facilitate this kind of process, which brings me to Sandra. And I would say the counterfactual here is not necessarily, even if we didn't have those four mechanisms, two are independent, two are dependent on the regime. It may have been that having, an economic boom under conditions of democratic competition would not necessarily have led to any, cultural flourishing of that sort, because you need something extra, an extra, element in the recipe. I think only by doing comparative research we can get a better sense of that. But there is an interesting and provocative takeaway, which is under some conditions, having less politics in the way of organized politics perhaps is good for culture, because people have a limited attention span, and devoting more attention to culture as opposed to other forms of public spectacle, and politics is a form of public spectacle. So if you adopt a sort of competition-based frame, then perhaps you have a zero-sum game in which attention can be focused on certain things only, and so you liberate part of your attention and you reorient it, in a different direction. By the way, one of the other aspects of the spectacles that we didn't study in the book is non-cultural spectacles. For example, football was very big during that time. What explains the regime's attitude? I think there are two elements. You touched on them. The first one is after 1969, the regime feels very safe. They don't feel that they're threatened by the opposition and by the resistance, and therefore they feel that there is a very low cost to pay to gain a benefit, which is the regime's outside image. They want to appear much more liberal than they are, and therefore they decide it's a very, it's an easy and good trade-off. So they gain some external acceptance, and at the same time, they don't think they put themselves in danger. So I think that is the calculation. And it is a calculation, at least based on both studies that have been done on that question, but also testimonies of various actors during that time, both synchronous and immediately after the fact. Final point, the period after the transition, after 74, is not a very good period for culture. And a lot of the people who are very successful between 70 and 73 are not as successful afterwards. And there is a trend towards, highly politicized and highly, politically driven kind of art that initially is very successful, then becomes very limiting. And also you have the gatekeepers again. I mean, Mikis Theodorakis himself returns as a hero, and then he has a dispute with the Communist Party, and the Communist Party boycotts him, and the guy becomes marginalized. So it is not as if the liberalization creates conditions for a new sort of flourishing. In fact, the first few years after the transition to democracy is a period in which a lot of people like Savopoulos and others describe things in a way that is kind of depressing, which again is a sort of another revisionist kind of point to make. But I think it's worth reflecting about these kinds of questions. And the beauty of these periods of change is that you can observe a lot of unexpected processes unfolding in front of your eyes.
Having said that, Stathis, I do remember personally, I mean, in the second half of the 70s, concerts in Greece were really big. I mean, they were very emotional, very big. and there were mass kind of following. Music was very big in this.
It was very big, but it was declining. I mean, Theodorakis has a very big success in 75, but then if you read his biographer, Gail Horst, who was accompanying him, in 76 and 77, he didn't do as well.
But it's more about what is more for people, I think, because obviously Theodorakis is the figure that in many ways controls also how culture operates.
Yeah.
But what I am talking is actually what kind of impact that had on people. And I do remember that music was really kind of an instrument of their understanding of this, new age of politics. That's something I really kind of has been with me.
Thank you. David Merton, ESC. Thank you for a very interesting picture of what you've described as an implicit social contract, in which Othon described as a blurring of images and pictures. So what happened on the 17th of November? Was it inevitable?
Questions as well, right?
Thank you, Stathis. I really like your last point, because I think not knowing huge amount about Greek culture and not being able to understand the language, I thought that it showed to be sort of it seemed to me a very aesthetic illustration of agency under what is, often in the social sciences, it's a very homogenizing impact of just looking at the effects of causes. And I think similarly, you can see that in stuff about colonialism as well. Colonialism being sort of root of all the problems at the moment is a very popular way of presenting some of the issues we have. So I really like that aspect. But what I was trying to think about it in respect to, because you have to, what happens in Turkey, which goes for a similar phase in 1980, after 1982. So you have the very suppressive military regime, and then they step back, but they're still there. And so you have some sort of liberalization. But flourishing becomes, so the regimes doesn't democratize or transition in the same way, but there is an opening in that sense to a more sort of suppressive or light suppressive. But the difference there, I think, is that there was a heavy cultural engineering, which I assume didn't happen in that period. So the sort of the flourishing becomes, and this comes at the same time as the move to market economy, some sort of valorization of the sort of arabesque, fatalistic, ghetto, suburban, that sort of culture, or lowbrow culture, whereas previously, the sort of not to negatively portray that as snobby, not to be snobby about it, but previously, it was more sort of discussions were more about sort of opera and these sorts of things. So there was there's a very clear cultural engineering program. There's documents of it that the military adopts, and they implement it. So and there are obviously the ways in which actors repurpose that and so on and so forth. But I guess it's the question is to what extent there was cultural engineering, and did that impact what happened post the regime, the big regime.
Matthew.
So there's two questions from like a non-Greek, obviously non-expert, very far from this topic. But I wanted two things. One is when you were trying to explain, perhaps I'm not doing justice to because you kind of mentioned this, but you were kind of explaining the sort of the social changes, and you were showing these pictures, how they changed from 65 to 71, whatever. But I wonder whether the important thing here is that they were already present in 65. Somehow that there was this inertia from this boom in the early 60s. That is somehow that is what creates the conditions for the later boom. So you mentioned at the beginning of your introduction Iran, and if I think about Iran, what I think is it's a country that already has long-standing cultural tradition that somehow explains why, given the repression conditions, that culture can be quite present. So you mentioned some changes that were going on in the Greek society, but perhaps I don't want to make here to compete two explanations, but the fact that beyond the changes, the fact that there was already sort of a market, you could mention that, kind of looks to me more important. And the other thing is, you started with the kind of the question of can culture thrive under authoritarianism, and somehow that's the thesis of the book. But somehow the book also validates the antithesis, which is culture can be repressed, which it was actually repressed between 67 and 70. So the fact that somehow the two things happen in such a short period of time, and many of these social changes actually happen gradually, makes me wonder. And again, it's not trying to think here like about the clean factors that explain this, but here the important thing is the changes that happened within the regime that allowed these, created sort of open the windows of opportunity to flourish, because many of these things that you mentioned were already somehow present in 67 to 70, and you didn't have the boom. So again, trying here to look into the supply and demand side kind of factors, it seems that clearly, for whatever reason, the regime decides to allow this to happen.
So, do we have any more? No. So we've gotten around 6 minutes, right, to respond. And if you can say in the end, Stathis, what was the how did the Greek public receive your revisionism of that particular period? I would like to know, how they kind of react. Okay.
Okay, so let me start with the last question. I mean, it's very difficult to disentangle these things. There is a sentence that struck me, a sort of early resistant whose memoirs I've read, and he's arrested in 1968. He's put in prison, and he comes out in 1971. And he's shocked by the fact that many women wear trousers. So, and that is something. Of course, these are not systematic. It's not systematic evidence, but there is a sense of great speeding that. And there is a sort of exponential dimension in GDP per capita rise. You can have 7%, 8% change every year, and then that picks up a lot of speed. Of course, I mean, it doesn't work on its own because, as you mentioned, between 67 and 70, you have much less, and then it becomes a very big thing. But also these things have endogenous dynamics. Once you start, I mean, they work as an equilibrium point. Once they start picking up speed, then they work a bit like an avalanche, perhaps. So certainly, I wouldn't disagree. There are things that exist before, but I think that there is a qualitative change that happens in terms of, and you see, essentially you can see that from indirect sources like the type of advertisement you have in newspapers and magazines, the type of pictures you have, the way language is used. There are indirect elements, but you understand that there is something fundamental changing in these years. But again, it's more of a feeling. One could actually measure that. I'm just giving you my sense. In terms of cultural engineering, I think the cultural engineering is happening after the transition, and that is the state becomes much more involved in cultural production after 74 than before, under the new regime. And so, because culture becomes part of public policy in a way that it is not before. And also beforehand, the states, even though a few singers collaborate in sort of various activities, most of them stay out. Okay, so there's a very clear decision not to become associated with the state, which creates the possibilities for experimentation, makes people more serious about what they're doing because they have to live out of that. Whereas immediately after, you have an encroachment of the state that sometimes facilitates, but very often creates, all these sort of, negative effects. And it's very clear in the cinema. A lot of the best elements of the new Greek cinema are done in the first period. And then the new Greek cinema becomes a sort of caricature of itself that exists only because it's subsidized by the state. So it becomes almost a rent seeking activity. So you have that there. 17th of November, was it inevitable? Who knows? I mean, could it have been managed better? Could it have been repressed earlier? Could it have been channeled into something different? Who knows? I mean, it's very difficult to tell. It's impossible to tell, actually. What is very interesting is that there is an economic dimension to it, which is November of 73 is the first oil shock that really causes a tremendous amount of an economic shock in the Greek economy, and explains perhaps indirectly the fact that what began as a student protest became very amplified by the participation of non-student people who may have been motivated equally, and it's very difficult to disentangle these things, by economic concerns and the immediate shock of the economic crisis than with political ones. And therefore gave and amplified the student protests and turned them into an uprising, essentially. And the other very interesting question is, would the hardliners coup, would it have taken place without the uprising in the Polytechnic School? We know that it was under preparation. We know that there were many people in the military who were opposed to the liberalization and to the opening. But certainly the fact that this uprising took place facilitated their planning. So there are lots of question marks, and I think the point is to discuss them because they open up very tantalizing and interesting possibilities. And we always think about, with counterfactuals in our mind. So making them explicit always is a good idea. But we shouldn't use them in order to venture answers that we don't have. That's my best. So the reception. It's early to say. I mean, the book has done very well in terms of sales. It's in its second edition. There were two types of reaction that were interesting. The first one, because the publishers would, put up some ads in social media. A lot of people who didn't bother to even figure out what the book was about took it as a defense of the dictatorship. So you have that kind of knee-jerk reaction that is very natural for social media. And the second type of reaction is from academics who deal with these kinds of questions. I don't think they see me as a sort of an interloper, not part of, and therefore the reaction was very interesting because they claim that everything that is in the book we already knew, which is a kind of interesting argument. And therefore the book is not as original as it claims. But I think it's too early. I think this is the kind of book that needs a lot of time to be absorbed. And so the idea was not to do something that was flashy, but to produce something that will stay out and have its own impact through time, but not by changing people's opinions necessarily, but by opening up conversations that have not happened. But as I said, for me, the main payoff was the fun I had writing it. So that cannot
Absolutely.
And I think it shows.
Congratulations, Stathis, for this excellent big book. I mean, I couldn't read it lying down, I have to say, because my hands were trying to hold the pages and read it.
If you buy 2 copies, you can use it for free.
So we wish you big success to the book. Maybe also get it into the television program as well. That would be great to see. There's a lot of material there. Thank you all for coming. It's been terrific.